turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis chapter 31, verse number 7. And as you're turning there, let me remind you of why Jacob wanted to leave Haran and return to his homeland, which was Canaan. First of all, there was a lot of animosity between Jacob and his in-laws. You see, Laban and his sons resented the fact that Jacob had become quite wealthy. They resented the fact that he actually had what we would call the Midas touch. Seemed like everything that Jacob touched turned to gold. Now, that was okay as long as Jacob was working specifically and solely for Laban. But once he started earning his own wages, they resented the fact that he was becoming just as wealthy as them, and there probably was a time when he superseded them. And they actually resented that fact. And Jacob realized it was only going to get worse. And he realized that if he continued to stay at Haran, something bad was going to happen. So, that's why he wanted to leave, or at least the first reason. The second reason that he wanted to leave Haran was because his father-in-law was cheating him. In fact, Laban was doing everything in his power to stop Jacob from prospering, but it didn't seem to matter. He still managed to come out on top. And last but not least, Jacob wanted to leave Haran because God told him to. So Jacob and his wives, Rachel and Leah, decided to sneak out of town and to head to Canaan. And that's where we continue on with the story in verse number 17. So let's read verses 17 and 18. Then Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels. And he carried away all his livestock and all his possessions which he had gained, his acquired livestock which he had gained in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Now, where he was going wasn't just this broad place. He was actually going to Beersheba, which is about 460 miles from Haran as the crow flies. And of course, that's where his father was at the time. Now, let me show you where that is on a map, because most of us really don't have a good idea about where things are in Israel. This is the Dead Sea, this is the Jordan River, and this is the Sea of Galilee. And you actually have a little bitty lake up here called Lake Hula. It's the Hula Valley up here. I don't know if they do the hula, but anyways, that wasn't good, was it? Anyways, this is the Hula Valley and has a little bitty lake, and it flows into the Sea of Galilee, and out of the Sea of Galilee comes the Jordan River and flows into the Dead Sea, and this is one of the lowest places on earth, and that's why it is the Dead Sea. It doesn't flow out, it just kind of stagnates there, and it has all of these minerals. But anyway, Beersheba is down here. Can you see Beersheba? Well, Beersheba is what is known as the Negev, which means it's a wilderness area. In fact, if you get a chance to go with me to Israel sometime, hopefully we can go to Beersheba, because when you go out there, you think, how in the world did they live out here? It is a wilderness, but there was a well that Abraham had dug, and so the family did live out there. And anyways, that's where he was heading. Now, Jacob's children were too young to walk all that way. In fact, Reuben, his firstborn son, was about 12 to 13 years old at this time. And Joseph, who was the youngest, if you remember, Benjamin hadn't been born yet, was about 6 years old. So they couldn't cover this distance of about 450 miles as the crow flies. But you couldn't go as the crow flies. So it was probably closer to 550 to 600 miles, and he had little bitty children. So he put his wives and his children on camels. Now, he did that for two reasons. First of all, he wanted them to be comfortable, but the most important reason was because he wanted to get as far away from Haran as fast as he could, because he knew that his father-in-law was going to be coming after him, because he knew what type of man Laban was. And Laban was going to be upset when he left. So he could cover more ground if he took his children and his wives and he put them on camels. And then what they would do is they drove the livestock, and they drove them hard. In fact, we're going to find out a little bit later before he crosses over and goes actually into the land in Canaan, he has to give time for them to rest. And the reason he does is because he drove them so hard. Now, some scholars will tell you that camels weren't domesticated at that time, but people, that's not true. Let me tell you why they say that. They say that because they continually repeat what they've always read. You see, in the 1800s, they really believed that camels had been domesticated at that time. And as a result of that, you had all of these scholars that would always quote that. But archaeology has proven that they domesticated camels in the Middle East around 2000 BC. That's why Abraham had camels. So when you read your commentary, you hear someone who's supposedly very knowledgeable, and they tell you, well, camels weren't even domesticated back then. Then, the Bible just made error, and it made an error. That's not true. They were domesticated then. Now, the livestock that Jacob took with him were all his. They weren't Laban's. He had acquired them legitimately, and the narrator wants us to know that. He wants us to know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, and we'll see why in just a little bit. So what the narrator did, in other words, the person who wrote the Bible, the book of Genesis, and who was that? Moses. So Moses wanted us to know that these livestock were Jacob's. They were not Laban's, and we're going to see why in just a minute. So what he did was he continually used the third person pronoun his, referring to Jacob. They weren't Laban's livestock, they were his livestock. They were Jacob's livestock. He also used the phrase that he had gained twice, which was totally unnecessary, but he did that in order to emphasize that everything that Jacob took with him was his and it was not Laban's. And it was his legitimately. He had gained it. In the Hebrew, it means that he had worked for it and earned it, so it was rightfully his. Look at verse number 18 again, and you'll see what I'm talking about, because really he's very redundant. But he wants you to understand this principle, and we're going to see why in just a second. Then Jacob rose, and he set his sons and his wives on camels. Now, remember, before I go on, he was an indentured servant. That means he agreed to work for Laban for a specific period of time in order to receive something. He was not bought as a slave. If he had been bought as a slave and he married and he had children, if he was set free, his wife and his children were not. But he was an indentured servant. So Moses wants us to understand these were his children, these were his wives. And then it goes further in verse 18. And he carried away all his livestock and all his possessions, which he had gained. The word gained in the Hebrew means he had earned it. They were legitimately his. His acquired livestock. And again, he uses another Hebrew word to let us know that they were his because he worked for them, which he had gained in Padan Aram to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. So it's very important to the narrator that we know that everything that Jacob took with him was his. And he didn't take anything that was Laban's. Now, Rachel did, but not Jacob. And you'll see why this is important later on. Now, look at verses 19 and 20. Now, Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob stole away unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. Now, shearing sheep was always carried out in the spring, actually early spring. And depending upon the size of your flock, it took anywhere from 3 days to a week and a half. And of course, you went to where the sheep were in order to shear them. And remember how far these flocks were from Jacob. They were 3 days away, which meant that Laban was going to be gone for several days. So it was the perfect time for Jacob to leave, but it was also the perfect time for Rachel to sneak into her father's tents and to steal the household idols. And that's what she did. She stole his household idols. Look back at verse number 19, and I want you to underline the word stole. Now, Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. Now, the word stole is translated from the Hebrew word ganab. And the Jews had two different words for stealing. You had ganab and gazal. And they mean two different things. Ganab refers to a furtive act, and gazal refers to a non-furtive act. Now, does everyone know what the word furtive means? Furtive. And just in case you don't, but it's one of those words that you try to use. It means to be secretive, so no one sees what you're doing. It's one of those things where you're trying to, through stealth, sneak around, no one saw you do it. So ganab refers to stealing something when no one's looking, so they won't know who did it. And people, that's what Rachel did. She snuck into her father's tent and she stole his household idols, and no one knew she did it, not even Jacob. And we're going to find this out a little bit later, because Jacob would have never said what he did if he had known Rachel had done that, but he didn't know that. Now, why in the world did Rachel steal Laban's idols? Was Rachel an idolater like her father? Was she? No. Not at the time that she stole them. Before Jacob came to visit, I'm sure she was. But by this time, she is not an idolater, and we're going to see why in just a little bit. In fact, it'll be next week, but let me just tell you how we know and give you a little sneak preview. We know she was an idolater because she purposely profaned them. And people, that's something you wouldn't do if you were an idolater. And I'll show you how she profaned them next week. So, if she wasn't an idolater, why in the world would Rachel steal Laban's idols? Does anyone know? Precious metals. No? Good suggestion. Anyone else? What? Did you say pride? Spite. Good. Yes. See, to understand why she stole Laban's idols, you have to understand what they were and what they represented. You see, the word for idols here in verse number 19 is translated from the Hebrew word teraphim. People, that's not the common word for idols in the Old Testament. So these weren't common idols that you worship, they were something else. So let me explain what they were. At that time, almost everyone believed that there were many gods and not just one God. Monotheism wasn't popular at that time. Everyone believed that there were many, many gods. And they believed that these gods were just like people. That means that they couldn't be in two places at one time. They could only be in one place at one time. They were not omnipresent. So they believed that the gods, just like people, normally stayed in one location or one area, and they ruled over that particular area. So if you owned land, you had idols or teraphim that symbolized or represented the gods that ruled over your land. So each clan had their own teraphim, and the leader of the clan kept them in his tent or his house because that designated that he was the leader of the clan. He was the leader of the clan that owned all of this land. Now, the firstborn usually inherited the teraphim, which meant that he was the leader of the clan that owned all of the land that these gods ruled over. But that's why they were referred to as household gods, because they were the gods of their household. In other words, they were the gods over the land that they owned. Now, some scholars believe that Rachel stole the household gods so that her firstborn son, Joseph, could claim the right to inherit her family's land and be the leader of the clan. And you'll find that in several different commentaries. In fact, the NICOT says that. The word biblical commentary brings that up. But that's really not true. And let me tell you why that's not true. Because many times I'll say, that scholar's wrong. And people say, how can you say that? It's because of what I know. As I've said before, women didn't inherit land at that time. And sons received their inheritance from their father, not their father-in-law. So even if her son possessed the teraphim, the household idols, it wouldn't have given him the right to inherit her father's property or to be the leader of the clan. It didn't work that way. And there was no way just having the teraphim would do that. So why in the world did she steal the idols? Well, it's because she did it out of spite. You see, Rachel was a lot like her father, Laban. Just look at the way that she treated her sister. In her mind, she was in competition with Leah. And if she couldn't have children, then Leah couldn't have children. Remember what took place when we were studying the story? I mean, Leah was a baby-making machine. She was spitting out not just children, but she was spitting out boys. And so Rachel comes to her, to Jacob and says, give me a baby or I die. And he's like, I'm not God, I can't do that. And he gets all upset. But it says that Leah stops producing children. She's barren at that time, and we find out why. The reason she's barren at that time is because Rachel says, don't you dare sleep with her. Why? Because she was in competition. And if she couldn't win the competition, then she was going to make sure Leah didn't win the competition, even if it meant hurting the family. Even if it meant that she wasn't going to produce any more sons, which tells us that she was a lot like Laban. So I personally believe that she was trying to get back at her father for the way that he had treated not only her, but her husband Jacob. So she took what he would have valued the most. She took the things that symbolized that he was the leader of his clan. Now, as you read the story, it says that his kinsmen came with him. But why did they come with him? Because he was the leader of the clan. In fact, it's kind of interesting, but when it uses the word sons, when he went through and he culled Jacob's herds, many times that word doesn't just refer to physical sons, but it can refer to nephews. It can refer to any type of relative. But what's interesting is Laban was the leader of the clan. And the teraphim always reminded people, it symbolized and represented that he was the leader of the clan. They were the household gods. They were the idols of these gods that supposedly ruled over their household or their land. And it was the thing that symbolized the title deed to the land that the clan owned. So what's kind of interesting is Rachel's upset with her dad, so guess what she does? She sneaks into the tent and she takes the things that he values the most, and here's what's interesting. She puts them in a place where she will profane them purposely. And we'll find that out next week. So he fled with all that he had. This is verses 21 through 23. So he fled with all that he had. He arose and he crossed the river and he headed toward the mountains of Gilead. And Laban was told on the third day that Jacob had fled. Then he took his brethren with him. Now it's interesting, brethren simply means those of his clan. And he pursued him for 7 days' journey. And he overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. So Jacob was heading for the mountains of Gilead, which are located on the south of the Sea of Galilee, the south side of the Sea of Galilee, on the east side of the Jordan River. In fact, let me show you where that is. Again, here's the Dead Sea. This is the tip. Can you see at the very top there? That's the tip of the Sea of Galilee, and of course the Jordan River comes down. Right here, notice where it says Gilead. These are the mountains of Gilead. And then it actually goes on up, and then you come to a plateau, which we call the Golan Heights. It's kind of interesting. I'll tell you a little story that the last time that I was in Israel, we actually went to the Golan Heights. And the Golan Heights at one time was controlled by Syria until the 67 war, in which Israel drove them out, and they occupied that. But now the UN, they're actually on the Golan Heights, and they occupy that. It's kind of a buffer zone between Syria and Israel. But we got a chance to go through the Syrian bunkers. And I'm going through these bunkers, and at the time, we're going through the book of Revelation. And I'm going through it, and we're seeing all of this graffiti that's written on the wall. And it's all in Arabic except for one thing. One little saying says, "We pray for your return, Al-Mahdi." And who's the Al-Mahdi? The 12th Imam. We know it as the Antichrist. And underneath it are all of these Arabic names. And I just kind of froze when I saw that. But anyways, the Gilead Mountains are actually south of that, and they're on the east side of the Jordan River. They're in what in today we would refer to as Jordan. In fact, if you go with me to Israel, we're going to go on over to Petra, but we'll also go to Mount Nebo. Nebo is where Moses came, and Moses was able to look out over the land. And on a clear day, you can not only see the Dead Sea, but you can see all the way up the valley, and you can actually see on a very clear day what would be the edge of the Israel territory. So Moses from Mount Nebo was actually able to look out over the promised land, but he wasn't able to cross over. So it's really a fantastic sight. But anyways, it took Laban 10 days to catch up with Jacob because Jacob had a 3-day head start. Remember, he took off, but because his flocks were 3 days away from the home area, it says that it took him 3 days before he found out that Jacob had left. So Jacob had traveled about 300 miles because a day's travel was about 30 miles, and it took him 3 days before he found out and 7 days to catch up, which is 10 days. So Jacob was about 300 miles away from Haran by the time that Laban caught up with him. And that's why, of course, he was putting his wives and children on camels, is because he wanted to travel as fast as possible. So he made great time. But Laban didn't give up. He kept chasing him. And again, the reason that Jacob was trying to travel so fast is because his hope was that he would get so far up that Laban would say, "I'll forget it." Remember, he didn't know what Rachel had done. He knew that he'd taken only what was his, but he knew what kind of man Laban was, and he knew Laban was not the type of man that would let all that wealth slip out of his fingers. So what he was hoping to do was put such a distance between them that if Laban did come chasing him after 4 or 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, he'd finally say, just let him go. He's too far away. But Laban wouldn't stop pursuing him. And he went as far as 300 miles to the Gilead mountains. Look at verses 24 through 30. But the previous night, God had appeared to Laban the Aramean in a dream, and he told him, I'm warning you, you leave Jacob alone. Laban caught up with Jacob as he was camped in the hill country of Gilead. He'd already made it past the Sea of Galilee. He's now in the mountainous area that's south of the Sea of Galilee. So he's definitely in the land of Canaan, or at least he's equal to that. All he has to do is cross over the Jordan River. But anyways, he caught up with Jacob as he was camped in the hill country of Gilead, and he set up his camp not far from Jacob's. What do you mean by deceiving me like this? Laban demanded. How dare you drag my daughters away like prisoners of war? Why did you slip away secretly? Why did you deceive me? And why didn't you say you wanted to leave? I would have given you a farewell feast with singing and music accompanied by tambourines and harps. Do you believe him? No. He's lying, and we'll find out why in just a minute. Why didn't you let me kiss my daughters and my grandchildren and tell them goodbye? You have acted very foolishly. And here's why. Notice what he says. I could destroy you. I could slay you. I could kill you. I could beat you within an inch of your life, and there's nothing you could do about it. But the God of your father appeared to me last night, and he warned me. Leave Jacob alone. Now, I can understand your feeling that you must go and your intense longing for your father's home. But why have you stolen my gods? Now, let's be honest. There is no way that God would have told him to let him or to leave him alone unless Laban had been planning to harm Jacob. God doesn't just come out and tell us. He doesn't say, Alan, don't do that, unless he knows I'm going to do it. So the only reason that God would have told him to leave him alone is because he knew what Laban was planning. And Laban was planning to harm him. He was planning to either kill Jacob or to beat him within an inch of his life so he could steal his wealth. You see, people like Laban, as I said, can't stand to see wealth slip through their fingers. So all the time that Jacob was building his great wealth, when he was building his flocks and he was becoming wealthier and wealthier, Laban was planning or trying to plan out a way that he could steal it from Jacob, a way that he could take it away from him. And we know that because Laban actually makes a Freudian slip, and he let the cat out of the bag. Did you know that? How many of you have read the story over and over again? Have you ever seen the Freudian slip? Let me show it to you. Now, first, does everyone know what a Freudian slip is? Remember, Freud was not living back then. We just refer to it as that. But let me explain what a Freudian slip is. It's when you slip up and you say something that reveals how you really feel inside or how you really think. It reveals your true motives and intentions, even if it's subconsciously. You said something and it's like, my, I didn't realize that I actually felt that way. I guess I do. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about. Look at verse number 43. Then Laban replied to Jacob. Who's talking? Laban is. He replies to Jacob, these women are my daughters. These children are my grandchildren. That's true. True statement. And these flocks are my flocks. In fact, everything you see, Jacob, is mine. Not true. That's why Moses spent so much time overemphasizing the fact that everything that Jacob took was his. He earned it. It was part of his wages. He did it legitimately. He did not deceive, trick, or cheat. Everything he had was his. But Laban is so frustrated that what's in his heart, even if he doesn't even realize it, finally slips out. He said, your flocks aren't your flocks, they're my flocks. In fact, everything that you have is mine. And that was the Freudian slip. You see, Laban had so coveted Jacob's wealth that in his mind, he had come to think of it as his. Somehow, somewhere, it was going to be his. And that's why that slipped out of his mouth. Now, I really believe that this is what Jacob felt when he was there, when he saw how he coveted his things and he saw the resentment. And he began to realize that if I stay in Haran, my father-in-law is going to do something. One day, I'm going to not wake up. Start to say wake up dead. I guess you don't wake up. One day, I'm not going to wake up. An accident's going to happen, but it's really not an accident. And God tells him, you need to live. But that's the Freudian slip. Somehow, somewhere, he was going to get this, and he had wanted it for so long that literally, subconsciously, he thought of it as his. Now, people, he didn't mean to say it. It just came out. Jacob's flocks were supposed to be his flocks. Jacob's wealth was supposed to be his wealth. But again, the reason he felt that way was because he had been coveting it for so long. And he had been trying to figure out how to take it away from Jacob for so long that eventually he began to think of it as his. It was not Jacob's, it was his. And that's why he said it. It just slipped out. But it revealed how he really thought. It revealed what was in his heart. That's why we refer to it as a Freudian slip. So when Jacob left, all Laban could see was all of this wealth that should have been his was slipping through his fingers. And people, that's the real reason he pursued him for 10 days. And I'm telling you, Jacob knows how he is. And he's pushing those flocks as hard as he can go, about to kill them. Because before they go over the Jordan, he's got to allow them to rest. But the reason he's pushing so hard is because he knows what kind of man he is, and he had figured out what he was going to do. And sure enough, here comes Laban, and it takes him over 300 miles to catch up with him. But when he does, he's ready to kill him and take it back, and he's going to do it under a different pretense. But then he can take all this wealth back. So God comes to him in a dream, and he says, don't you touch him. You leave him alone. And you even be careful how you speak to him. So, he finally reveals the real reason why he's there a little bit later on. He can't stand to see Jacob leaving with all of this wealth. But here's what's interesting. Laban couldn't say that, at least he couldn't say that out loud. So he had to come up with another reason why he had pursued Jacob so tenaciously. Now, the only reason that we know that the truth was, or we know the truth through this Freudian slip, is because Moses made such a big deal about overemphasizing the fact that it was Jacob's, so that when we see him say this, we know how he felt. And we're able to see what he was thinking and what was really in his heart. Now, again, many times we look over these little details and we think, why in the world is it being redundant? It's being redundant so when something happens further in the story, you can see what the meaning is. Now, as I said, Laban couldn't reveal the real motive for chasing Jacob, so he had to come up with other reasons for going after him. And what's great about this is he had 10 days to think about it. Now remember, the night before he confronted him, God came and he warned him and told Laban, you leave me alone, don't you dare touch him. And you can be careful how you speak to him. So when Laban finally confronts Jacob, he had to be very cautious because of God's warning, but he still had to save face. Now why did he have to save face? Because he brought the whole clan with him. He brought them all. And they had done double time to catch up with Jacob. So to save face, he had to accuse Jacob of something very seriously. People, you don't go chasing after someone for 10 days over 300 miles with camels just so you can kiss your grandchildren and your daughters goodbye. How many of you have family that lives maybe in Oklahoma City or something like that, and they leave and you forgot to kiss them goodbye? And you drive all the way to Oklahoma City, you knock on the door and say, I just didn't kiss you goodbye. Oh, no. Now, he's going to start off with that. But he's got to come up with a really good excuse, a really good reason, especially in front of the clan, because he's brought them all with him. He wants this show of strength for why he's going to do what he's going to do to Jacob. So what does he say? He says, why did you steal my household gods? Why did you steal my idols? So Rachel gave him the excuse that he needed to be able to chase. It was the perfect excuse to confront Jacob with. Look at verses 28 through 30 again. Why didn't you let me kiss my daughters and grandchildren and tell them goodbye? You have acted very foolishly. I could destroy you. It's in my power. I brought the clan with me. I am a big, powerful person, and you're nothing. But the God of your father appeared to me last night, and he warned me, leave Jacob alone. I can understand your feeling you must go and your intense longing for your father's home. But why have you stolen my gods? Ooh, that's my reason for coming. Now, of course, Jacob didn't know what Rachel had done. All he knew was that he hadn't taken anything that belonged to Jacob. He'd only taken what belonged to him. So what did he tell Jacob or Laban to do? He said, you can search through my camp. And anything, not just the household gods, anything that you find that's not mine, you can have. I don't care what it is. And if you find the household gods, then the person who stole them will die. We'll put him to death. Now, if you've read some of the Newsy tablets and studied any of them, you know that that's one of the penalties. If you stole someone's household gods, then you could be put to death. And so he's coming and this is your custom. You find out who did it, you do it. The only thing is, Jacob didn't know that Rachel had done that. Now, here's what's interesting. Rachel knew her father would never find them. And I'll show you that next week.